Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Then hadith number 11 in our kitab of Hajj about the permissibility of making al-hijama in the state of ihram. From Ibn Abbas he narrates that the Prophet made hijama when he was a muhrim. And so we find if you have to make hijama on the head and you have to shave off some parts of the head so you can have the clear skin in order to make the hijama, then there's no fidya for shaving the hair off. The fidya is for shaving the whole head off, as what happened with Ka'b ibn Ujrah when he had head lice falling from his head. And the ulama have a consensus. Al-Imam al-Nawawi says that you can make hijama on the head or other parts of the body in the state of ihram, and that this is permissible. Hadith number 12, that the muhrim is allowed to take some eye treatment, that Umar ibn Ubaidillah ibn Ma'mar had sore eyes, so he wanted to put some kuhl on it, and a man by the name of Aban ibn Uthman forbade him from doing that, and he ordered him to apply aloe to it, aloe being a type of plant, and he justified it by saying that Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anh narrated that from the Prophet, that the Prophet would do that. Now, putting the kuhl on your eyes for medication purposes is permissible in the state of ihram or otherwise. Of course, if this is perfumed, then you ought not to do that, because you don't put perfume on the state of ihram. And putting on this sabir, which is aloes, is also permissible. As for putting on kuhl for the men for beautification purposes, then this would be resembling women, and one ought to refrain from that. Hadith number 13, that the muhrim is permitted to wash his hair and his body. Two men, Ibn Abbas and Al-Miswar ibn Makhrama, had a dispute. Ibn Abbas said that the muhrim washes his head. Al-Miswar says no, he doesn't. So Ibn Abbas then referred Al-Miswar to go and ask Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. So he did so, and he arrived at his place. Abu Ayyub at that time was taking a bath himself. He was covered. Al-Miswar said salam to him, and Abu Ayyub said, "Who is this?" And he replied, "Ana Abdullah ibn Hunayn. I am Abdullah ibn Hunayn." He said that Abdullah ibn Abbas sent me to you, asking you how the Prophet would wash his head whilst in a state of ihram. And so Abu Ayyub lowered the curtain or the cloth covering him up until his head could be seen, and he asked the person to pour water over him. And when that other person poured water over him, he started to rub his head with his hands back and forth, going backwards and then forward, rubbing it like that. And he said, "Like this I saw the Prophet do it." So we can take from this narration that the Prophet washed his head, and that is permissible in the state of ihram. The Prophet took a bath for entering Mecca, and prior to that he took a bath for the ihram, and also a third place he took a bath for standing at Arafah. 3 places in which the Prophet took a bath. And it appears that these are ritualistic bathing, so that one ought to do this. It is recommended, because this taking a bath is a type of veneration for the ihram, for entering Mecca, and for standing at Arafah. We can take from this narration that in a dispute you refer to the ulama. So if the person disputing with you does not agree with you, he obviously does not respect your authority. So why don't you refer him to somebody whose authority he will respect? This is a great practical lesson for us, because we always get into disputes with people who are not going to accept our word for it. We can also take from this narration that when it comes to information about the deen, pertaining to the knowledge of the deen, then the statement of one person is enough for you to accept. Notice that Al-Miswar did not say to Abu Ayyub al-Ansari that you need a second person to testify what you're saying, because we're going to accept only 2 witnesses and no less than 2 witnesses. This is not a civil dispute where you would require 2 witnesses, for example, in a financial issue. But this rather is knowledge of the deen being passed down, and this does not require 2 witnesses. The khabar al-wahid, the news item given by one person, is sufficient. Hadith number 14, about what should be done with a muhrim if he dies in a state of ihram. From Abdullah ibn Abbas, he says, a person was at Arafah with the Prophet, and he fell off his riding animal, and he broke his neck and died. The Prophet was informed of this, and he said, اغسلوه بماء وصدر وكفنوه في ثوبين. Wash him with water and lote tree leaves, and shroud him or make the kafan on him with the two clothing which he is wearing, the rida and the izar. وَلَا تُحَنِّطُوا, and do not put hanut on him, which is a type of strong perfume. وَلَا تُخَمِّرُوا رَأْسَهُ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ يَبْعَثُهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ مُلَبِّيًا, and do not cover his head, for Allah will raise him up on Yawm al-Qiyamah saying the talbiyah. So we pick up from this narration that you ask the people of knowledge when you are unsure of what to do. As the companions here were unsure, what should we do? He died in a state of ihram. Is there any particular special ruling here? And so they learned that there is particular rulings which apply to the muhrim. We learn that washing the deceased is fardu kifaya. The Prophet did not do it. He ordered others to do it. So somebody must do it at least. Otherwise everybody is sinful. Notice that you do not give tayammum in the event that you're unable to wash the deceased. If you're unable to wash the deceased, then there's nothing upon you, because the idea is to clean him. Tayammum is not about physical cleanliness, it is about spiritual cleanliness, meaning to say, to put you in a state in which you can perform the salah. So it's the spiritual purity, not the physical one. Here, with washing the deceased, we're talking about physically cleaning him. You wash him with water and lote tree leaves. Well, the lote tree leaves are not intended in and of themselves, rather any cleaning agent will do. Nowadays you have chemical soaps and so on, that's fine. But this soap should not be perfumed. We also learn that he is shrouded with his two items of clothing which he is wearing. Normally it is 3 white winding sheets, as was done with the Prophet. Notice he says, do not cover the head. That's because this person is still in the state of ihram and you're not allowed to wear any head clothing. And Allah will raise him up saying the talbiyah. This is the same as a person who dies fighting in the way of Allah, then Allah will raise him up even with his blood stains. But his blood stains will smell better than misk even. So these two actions are parallel, and the reason they're parallel is because you died in the way of Allah Jalla wa Ala. Both the fighting and the Hajj are a form of jihad, or a form of striving in the way of Allah. And so Allah will raise you up in that state, so that everyone can openly see the righteousness upon which you died. And this resurrection is going to be a corporeal resurrection. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, بَلْ قَادِرِينَ عَلَىٰ أَن نُسَوِّيَ بَنَانَهُ. Nay, we are capable even to create his fingertips again. So even the minor details of your body will be recreated on the day of resurrection. We find that it is not legislated for you to say, مَحَلِّي حَيْثُ حَبَسْتَنِي. My place or time of exiting the ihram is the place where you hold me back, as if, which is something that the ill person would say. Because if you make this condition without any particular need to do so, without you being ill, then it means that when you die, you exit the state of ihram, which means that you will not be resurrected making the talbiyah in the sacred state of ihram. So therefore, obviously, this is not a good idea. Now, it needs to be noted here that in one of the narrations in Sahih Muslim, and this is not found in Al-Bukhari, it is only in Muslim, in this same chapter, the Prophet said, وَلَا تُخَمِّرُ رَأْسَهُ وَلَا وَجْهَهُ. Do not cover his head, neither his face. Now, these words, neither his face, most scholars say that this is shadh, it is an anomaly, hence we don't go by it. So a man can cover his face in the state of ihram, because if we go by this narration, we would have to say that in a state of ihram, you're not allowed to cover your face. However, we would say that to be on the safe side, the ihtiyat would be that you don't cover his face, and that your face in the state of ihram, you ought not to cover it. Hadith number 15, about making the shart or condition if you think you will not be able to carry on with the Hajj or the Umrah. From Aisha, she says the Prophet entered upon Duba'a bint Az-Zubayr. She was the Prophet's cousin. She said, O Messenger of Allah, I want to perform the Hajj, but I am suffering an illness. And so the Prophet told her, Hujji washtariti anna mahilli haythu habastani. Perform the Hajj, but make the condition with Allah that my exiting the ihram is where you hold me back. So we say then, picking up from this hadith, that if you are ill and you fear that you will not be able to carry on with the ihram, then you can make this condition. You can make this condition if you fear illness, or if you fear that some enemies along the way might hold you back. Now both of these, the illness and the enemies, are outside your control. Allah Jalla wa Ala will decree whatever He decrees. So this is why you make the condition with Allah that my exiting the ihram is where you hold me back. The Prophet said in the Sahih al-Bukhari that your condition is valid with Allah. So the point is, this condition is valid anytime you fear something. It might be that a woman fears her menses will come, or a person fears that he will miss the standing at Arafah. Any sort of valid fear in which you feel you may not be able to complete the Hajj, then you can make this condition. What's the benefit of this condition? The benefit of this condition is that you leave the state of ihram without needing to sacrifice an animal from the Bahimatul An'am. Otherwise, if you are held back, you would need to sacrifice an animal from the Bahimatul An'am in order to be released from the ihram. This is the fa'idah. But we say that if you do not fear anything, and you just want to make this condition, then that is not legislated, and its presence is like its absence. Hadith number 16, about the different types of ihram you can enter. From Aisha, she says, we left for the Prophet in the Hajjatul Wada', and the Prophet said, من أراد منكم أن يهل بعمرة فليهل فلولا أني أهديت لأهللت بعمرة. Whoever wants to make the ihlal or the talbiyah for the umrah, then let him do so. If I did not bring along the sacrificial animal, I would have also performed the umrah. So she says, from the people were those who made the talbiyah for the umrah, and from them were performing the hajj. She says that I was from those wanting to perform the umrah. She says, we left until we reached Mecca, and at Yawm Arafah, I started the menses. So it means she could not perform the umrah, and the Prophet told her, دعي عمرتك وانقضي رأسك وامتشطي وأهلي بالحج. Leave your umrah and undo your hair and comb it and make the ihlal for the hajj. She says, so I did so. Then when it was time to leave, the Prophet sent me and my brother Abdurrahman ibn Abi Bakr to Tan'im, which is the hill outside the haram, and she says that she made the umrah from there. Now there are many narrations in this chapter, and they speak of basically the same thing, that the Prophet ordered those people who had not brought along a sacrificial animal to make the ihram for the umrah, meaning an umrah separately. Those people who have a sacrificial animal are not allowed to release themselves from the ihram until the animal is sacrificed. As Allah tells us, وَلَا تَحْلِقُوا رُؤُوسَكُمْ حَتَّى يَبْلُغَ الْهَدْيُ مَحِلَّهُ. And do not shave your head until the sacrificial animal reaches its place of sacrifice, meaning until you have sacrificed it. But as for those who do not have a sacrificial animal, then it is better for them to perform a separate umrah, then release themselves from the ihram, and then perform a separate hajj afterwards. This is the better way for those who do not have a sacrificial animal. The better way for those who do have a sacrificial animal which they have brought along is to perform the qiran which the Prophet performed. Now initially he was performing the single hajj, and so in some narrations you find that the Prophet was performing the ifrad, the single hajj. But afterwards Jibreel came to the Prophet and he told him to say umratun fi hajjah, an umrah in a hajj. So in other words, he combined the two, which is qiran. The benefit of the qiran is that it depends on your intention. Now you have an intention of both the umrah and the hajj, so you go away with two rituals of the umrah and the hajj. With the ifrad, it's just a single hajj. In the narration it talks about the Laylatul Hasba. Aisha says this is the 14th, when they are to leave Mecca to go back to Mina, and they would stay at a place called Hasba, or it's called Muhassab, which was a place full of stones and pebbles. It is no longer like that because it's been redone and all smooth now. Hasba, also called Abdah, that's where the Prophet stayed the night before leaving for Medina. And this is not a place you stay the night as a means of worship. It's just that it was easiest for the Prophet to stay there. And this is what Aisha tells us, that he only stayed there not as a means of ibadah, but because it was easier for him to stay there before he leaves for Al-Madinah. Similarly, before entering Arafah, he stayed a little while at Namira. Not because this is an act of ibadah, but rather this is what makes life easier for him, just to stay there for a little while. And Namira is not part of Arafah. As for the one performing the qiran, does he have to offer a sacrificial animal like the mutamattir', the one performing the tamattu'? Most scholars say yes, he does. But if we look at the evidences, it seems to favor the Zahiriyya opinion, which says that he does not, because there's no analogy between the tamattu' and the qiran. With the tamattu' you leave the ihram, with the qiran you do not. And so this is why the sacrificial animal of the tamattu' is a thanksgiving for this ni'mah. However, we can say, to be on the safe side, you offer the sacrifice, and the Prophet ﷺ offered 100 animals as sacrifice, and these would have been a nafila sacrificial animals. So if that's the case, then it would not harm for you to sacrifice this animal if you are performing the qiran. We also learn from the narration of Aisha that the woman in the menstruation, she can do everything which the person performing the Hajj can do, except the tawaf, and henceforth the sa'i as well afterwards, because in the Umrah the tawaf comes before the sa'i. That's a necessity, and it's not the same as the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, in which you can do it in any order you want. But for the Umrah, the tawaf must come before the sa'i. So if you cannot perform the tawaf, then obviously you will not be able to perform the sa'i as well. And the reason why you cannot perform the tawaf is because the menstruating woman is not allowed to stay in the masjid. And of course, to perform the tawaf, it cannot be outside the masjid, it has to be inside the masjid. Just incidentally, it is not a condition that you should be in a state of wudu when performing the tawaf, because the tawaf is not like the salah, contrary to what has been narrated in the narration from Ibn Abbas that the tawaf is like the salah, except that Allah has permitted you to speak, so if you speak, then only speak goodness. Rather, we say that this is the statement of Ibn Abbas, if it is authentic, and between the salah and the tawaf there are many differences. There are more differences than there are similarities. But we say it is better to be in a state of wudu, because tawaf is an act of ibadah, and if you can be in a state of wudu, in a state of ritual purity, then this would be better for you. But is it a condition for the tawaf to be correct? Absolutely not. Notice what Aisha says, that after the Hajj she performed a separate Umrah, and she had to leave the Haram to go to Tan'im. And this is because with the Umrah, you need to make the Ihram from outside the Haram, and then you're going to come into the Haram. With the Hajj, however, you can make your Ihram inside the Haram, because the point is you're going to leave outside the Haram anyway when you go to Arafah. So you're going to combine between the Hill and the Haram. Whereas with the Umrah, you never leave the Haram. So this is why you would need to make the Ihram from outside the Haram, because Umrah is a visit. So it means you must come from outside the Haram. If you visit somebody's house, you have to come from outside that person's house into his house. So for example, you cannot visit your own house in which you are already living. That's not called a visit. The Tawaf al-Wada', the farewell Tawaf, should be the last major action you perform before leaving Mecca, except a necessary fard action. For example, you perform Tawaf al-Wada', then afterwards it is time to perform the Salat al-Jum'ah, for example. Let's say it's on a Friday. So yes, you can perform that Jum'ah and then leave. You don't have to perform another Tawaf al-Wada'. But as for performing the Tawaf al-Wada' and then going out for shopping, then this ought not to be done. What about if you intend to perform the Umrah and then you include the Hajj in it, so you make it from the Umrah to a Qiran? Now, majority of the scholars say this is permissible, but we say that this goes against the Hadith, because the Prophet ordered those performing the Hajj to change it to an Umrah if they don't have the sacrificial animal. Now, with this scenario, you're going the opposite way. You're performing the Umrah initially, and then now you're performing the Qiran. So it goes against the Hadith. So even though most scholars say it is permissible, we say it is better not to do such a thing. Rather, perform the Umrah separately, release yourself from the Ihram, and then the Hajj afterwards. In another wording of the narration, the Prophet told Aisha, إِنَّ هَذَا شَيْءٌ كَتَبَهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى بَنَاتِ آدَمَ. This is something that Allah has ordained on the daughters of Adam. فَقْضِي مَا يَقْضِي الْحَاجِ. So complete whatever the normal Hajji is completing. غَيْرَ أَنْ لَا تَطُوفِي بِالْبَيْتِ حَتَّى تَغْتَسِلِي. Except that you do not perform the tawaf around the house until you have bathed. And that will be the bathing after the menses. Notice he says the daughters of Adam alayhi salam, which means that the women are the daughters of Adam and the men are the sons of Adam, in contradiction to the popular evolution theory, which is making its rounds, injecting its lies into the minds of people. The Prophet said in the narration that if he could go back and do what he left off, he would not have brought along the sacrificial animal, and he would have made his Hajj into a separate Umrah. So here the Prophet said lo, which is a word of yearning to do something which is either impossible or almost impossible. So when you yearn for something, if this yearning is for something good, then this is permissible. If the yearning is for something evil, then this is evil and not permissible. Well, the second type of law is not the yearning but an information. So the Prophet, for example, saying لولا أنا لكان في الدرك الأسفل من النار. If it was not for I, then he, meaning Abu Talib, would have been in the lowest depths of Jahannam. So this law, meaning if, is an information item, and it is permissible to be used if what you are saying is true. Just like the statement of the Prophet here, it is true, so it is permissible to use this word law. Then the third type is the haram type, which is regret over something which has happened to you through the decree of Allah Jalla wa Ala. For example, you fail your exams, and then you regret, if only I had done it this way, then I would have passed, and you regret what happened, and you express displeasure at the decree of Allah. This is not allowed. And this is what opens up the doors of shaitan, as reported to us in the authentic hadith. Also in the chapter, the Prophet told Aisha that your tawaf around the house and between the Safa and Marwa would suffice you for both your Hajj and your Umrah, so that you don't need to perform a separate Umrah afterwards. But Aisha refused, and so the Prophet allowed her to go to Tan'im. Now Ibn Taymiyyah says that performing the Umrah after the Hajj is not legislated. The Prophet did not tell his Sahaba to do this, and none of them did this except for Aisha. So he says that anyone who's in the similar condition or state as Aisha, meaning having had her menses preventing her from performing the Umrah, then she performs it afterwards. Then for any lady in a similar state to Aisha, then she can perform the Umrah afterwards, otherwise it is not legislated. And that you can combine the Umrah and the Hajj all in one ritual. And the Prophet said, دَخَلَتِ الْعُمْرَةِ فِي الْحَجِّ إِلَى يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ, that the Umrah has entered into the Hajj up till يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ. So in other words, you can combine the two intentions. Also, we find in the narration that Abdullah ibn Abbas would order people to perform the tamattu', but Umar radiallahu anh and Abu Bakr did not order them to do that. They said just perform the Hajj and not the tamattu'. And the reason for this difference was that if people performed the tamattu', which is to perform the Umrah during the months of the Hajj, then during the rest of the year the house would become derelict. Nobody would be visiting it. So in order to encourage people to visit the house all year round, they said do not perform the tamattu'. Rather, perform the Umrah during other months. So that's the reason for the difference. Hadith 17, about the description of the Hajj. This is the long narration from Jabir ibn Abdullah, which Sahih Muslim has, but Al-Bukhari doesn't. And this is the basic narration when it comes to the description of the Hajj. The other narrations, they give us tidbits of the description of Hajj. This one, however, gives us a vast and deep description of the Hajj. It does not mention absolutely everything, but it does mention the bulk of the description. Let us go straight into the translation first. Ja'far ibn Muhammad reports on the authority of his father that we went to see Jabir ibn Abdullah to ask him questions. He says that Jabir ibn Abdullah opened his upper button and placed his hand on his chest. He says, I was a young boy during those days. And Jabir ibn Abdullah says, you are welcome, ask for whatever you want to ask. He says that Jabir ibn Abdullah had turned blind during those days. During his old age, he turned blind, mashallah. And so he could not immediately respond, and the time for the salah came. So they stood up and they prayed. Jabir ibn Abdullah led the prayer. And eventually he asked Jabir, tell me about the Hajj of the Prophet. And Jabir made 9 fingers with his hand. He said the Prophet stayed in Medina for 9 years and did not perform the Hajj. Then he made a public announcement in the 10th year that the Messenger is going to be performing the Hajj. A large number of people came to Medina because they wanted to perform the Hajj with him. He says we set out with him until we reached Dhul Hulayfa. He says Asma bint Umays, the wife of Abu Bakr, gave birth to Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr. And to this the Prophet told her to take a bath and to bandage your private parts so that the blood is kept in check, the postnatal bleeding, and you put on the ihram. The Prophet then prayed in the masjid and mounted al-Qaswa, that was his she-camel he would ride. The she-camel went out to a place called Al-Baydah. Jabir says, I saw as far as I could see in front of me just riders and pedestrians. That's how many people there were. And also to my right and to my left, just riders and pedestrians. So many people performing the Hajj with the Prophet in that year. and the Prophet was prominent amongst us, and the revelation or the Quran was descending upon him, and the Prophet knows its true significance. The Prophet made the talbiyah of the labbaik, which he goes on to describe, and the people also did the same thing. He says, we only had the intention of Hajj, being unaware of performing the Umrah, meaning performing Umrah during the months of Hajj. When we came to the house, the Kaaba, he touched the pillar, meaning the black stone, and he made 7 circuits, running in 3 of them and walking the 4, so making ramal in 3 circuits. Then he went on to the maqam of Ibrahim, and he recited, وَاتَّخِذُوا مِن مَقَامِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ مُصَلَّى, and take the place of Ibrahim as a place of prayer. And he prayed there 2 rak'at. In the first rak'at he recited Al-Kafirun, and in the second one he recited Al-Ikhlas. Then he returned to the black stone and he stroked it. Then after that he went to As-Safa and Al-Marwa, reciting the ayah, Inna as-Safa wal-Marwata min sha'airillah. As-Safa and Marwa are from the emblems of Allah, and he said, I begin with what Allah begins with. And so he mounted As-Safa first, till he saw the house, meaning the Kaaba. He faced the Kaaba, and he made Tawheed, so as to say La ilaha illallah, and he made Takbir, Allahu Akbar. And then he made the dua, La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah, lahul mulku wa lahul hamdu wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir. La ilaha illallah wahdah, anjaza wa'dah, wa nasara abdah, wa hazama al-ahzaba wahdah. He made this dhikr 3 times in total, making dua in between these adhkar. So he made this dhikr and the dua after it. So he did it 3 times each, dhikr and dua. Then he descended and went to Al-Marwa until he reached the lower part of the valley, and he ran a little. It's like a light jogging, or a ramal you can say, just like what you do in the tawaf, in the first 3 circuits of the tawaf al-qudum. So he ascended Marwa, and he did exactly the same thing in terms of the dhikr and dua. And when he was on the last tawaf of the sa'i, he said, if I had known beforehand what I have come to know afterwards, I would not have brought the sacrificial animal, and I would have performed an umrah instead. So whoever does not have the sacrificial animal with him, then he should make the ihram for the umrah, meaning a separate umrah. And to this, Suraqa ibn Malik ibn Ju'shum, he got up and he said, Ali amina hadha am li abad? Is this only for this year of ours or forever? And so the Prophet intertwined his fingers and he said, Dakhalat al-umratu fil hajji. Umrah has been included or enters into the Hajj. He said this twice, and then he went on to say, La bal li abad al-abad. No, but this is not just for this year, rather it is forever and ever. Then Jabir went on to say that Ali radiallahu anh arrived from Al-Yaman with the sacrificial animals for the Prophet, and he found Fatima to be one of those who exited the ihram, and she had put on dyed clothes, which of course you're not allowed to do in the ihram, putting on the perfume with the dye on it. And she had applied antimony, which is the black colouring in the eye. And Ali radiallahu anh showed disapproval to this, whereupon she said that my father has commanded me to do this. And so Ali went to the Prophet to ask about this, and the Prophet said, yes, she has told you the truth. Then the Prophet asked him, what did you say when you intended the Hajj? And Ali said, I made the ihram for the same purpose as the messenger. So whatever intention the messenger has, this is what I have. And then the Prophet said, well, I have my sacrificial animals with me, so you must not exit the ihram. Jabir said that the number of animals brought by Ali from Yemen was 100. So anyway, the people exited the ihram, those who did not have the sacrificial animal. As for those who did, then they were not allowed to exit the ihram. Those who exited the ihram, they had their hair clipped. Then it was the day of Tarwiyah, the 8th, and they went to Mina. Over there, the Prophet and the companions prayed the Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib and Isha, and Fajr prayer. Then they waited a little until the sun rose, and the Prophet commanded that a tent be pitched for him at Namira. This is a place just outside Arafah. So the Prophet went out, and the Quraysh did not doubt that he would halt or stop at the Al-Mash'ar al-Haram, because this is what the Quraysh would do. They would stop at the Al-Mash'ar al-Haram in Muzdalifah. because what happened there was the tribes of Arabia would come to Hajj and they would stay at Arafah. But the Quraysh would not go to Arafah. Rather, they would go to the Al-Mash'ar al-Haram, which is a small mountain or a hill at Muzdalifah, because this is in the Haram and they did not want to exit the Haram. So the Quraysh were expecting the Prophet to do the same thing, but he did not. The Prophet went out to Arafah. So anyway, he stayed at Namira until the sun had passed its meridian. Then he commanded that a qaswa should be brought and saddled for him. Then he came to the bottom of the valley and he gave a sermon to the people by saying, "Verily your blood, your property are as sacred to you as the sanctity of this day in this month, in this town of yours," meaning Mecca. "Behold, everything pertaining to the days of foolishness, Jahiliyyah, is abolished under my feet. Abolished also are the blood revenges of the days of Jahiliyyah, and the first one which I abolish is that of the son of Rabi'ah ibn al-Harith, who was nursed among the tribe of Sa'ad, and he was killed by the tribe of Hudayl." Rabi'ah ibn al-Harith was the cousin of the Prophet. So it is his revenge he has abolished, so nobody can accuse him of nepotism. And he says that the usury is also abolished, and the first usury I abolish is that of Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib. So again, no one can accuse him of nepotism. He also says, "Fear Allah concerning women, you have taken them on the security of Allah, and intercourse has been made halal for you by the words of Allah, but you too have rights over them, that they should not allow anyone to sit on your bed whom you do not like. But if they do that, then you can chastise them, but not severely. Their rights over you is that you should provide them with food and clothing in a fitting manner, in accordance with that which is good. I have left among you the book of Allah, and if you hold fast to it, you will never go astray. And you will be asked about me on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Now tell me, what will you say?" And the people said, "We will bear witness that you have conveyed the message, discharged your trust, and given sincere advice." And to that the Prophet held his forefinger towards the sky, pointing to it, and he said, "O Allah, be witness. O Allah, be witness." He said this 3 times in total. Then Bilal radiallahu anh pronounced the adhan, and they prayed the Salat al-Dhuhr. Then Bilal gave the Iqamah, and Salat al-Asr was prayed. So the Dhuhr and Asr were combined here. Then the Prophet mounted his camel until he reached his place of standing, which was a little mountain, which is nowadays called Jabal al-Rahmah. He made the belly of his camel face the rocks, and the pedestrians, those on foot, were in front of him. He faced the Qibla, and he stood there up until the Maghrib time. Then when the yellowness disappeared, and the disk had completely sunk beneath the horizon, he set off with Usama ibn Zayd sitting behind him, and he pulled the rope back until the head of Qaswa was almost touching the riding saddle. And when he came to an open place, he would let go of the rope a little bit, so the camel can walk faster. And then he reached Al-Muzdalifah, and he prayed there Al-Maghrib and Al-Isha with 1 adhan and 2 iqamas, 1 for each salah. So he combined the prayers, and he did not pray any nafilah in between. Then he lied down until Fajr time. He prayed the Salat al-Subh. After the Salat al-Subh, he went to the Al-Mash'ar al-Haram, which is a little hill, and he faced the Qibla, and he made dua, and he made takbir and tahleel, and he stood there up until when it was very light, but the sun had not risen yet though. And he left Muzdalifah before sunrise, and when he was leaving, Al-Fadl ibn Abbas was sitting behind him, not Usama ibn Zayd, who was sitting behind him when they arrived for Al-Muzdalifah. And Al-Fadl ibn Abbas was a man of good quality hair and fair skin, and he was handsome. Now there were a group of women by his side, and Al-Fadl began to look at them, and the Prophet took the face of Al-Fadl and turned it the other way, so he does not look at the women. And then he came to the bottom of a valley called Muhassir, and he urged Qaswa, the camel, to go a little faster. And he arrived at the Al-Jamratul Aqaba, which is near the tree, and he threw 7 pebbles, saying Allahu Akbar at every throw, and he did this in the bottom of the valley. Then he went to the place of sacrifice, and he sacrificed 63 camels with his own hand, and he gave the remainder to Ali. He then commanded that a piece of flesh should be put in a pot and it was cooked. So both the Prophet and Ali ate from the meat and drank from the maraq, the broth. Then the Prophet rode to the Kaaba and he prayed Dhuhr there at Mecca, and he came to the tribe of Abdul Muttalib, who were giving Zamzam water to the Hujjaj. And he said, "Draw water, O Banu Abdul Muttalib. Would not that the people would usurp this right of supplying water from you, I would have drawn this water along with you." So they handed him a basket and he drank the Zamzam water from it. And so with that point, this long narration ends. Okay, so let us pick up on some benefits of this long narration. We pick up that it is permissible for a person in Janaba or in the Hayd or Nifas to enter the state of Ihram, just like Asma bint Umays did. When did the Prophet make the Talbiyah? Well, here in the narration Jabir says when he reached Bayda. Ibn Umar narrates when he got up on his animal, the camel. Though there are different narrations, but every companion is just narrating what he particularly saw. Note in the narration it says that the Talbiyah is the Tawheed. He made the Ihlal of Tawheed. That's because the Talbiyah are words of Tawheed. Notice also that the Prophet made Ramal in 3 rounds and he walked the last 4. He made 3 full rounds of Ramal. Whereas in the Umratul Qadha, in the 7th year, they made Ramal in the first 3 rounds, but not the complete rounds, because between the Yemeni corner and the Blackstone corner, they walked. So notice the subtle difference there. Why would they make a Ramal of 3? Well, initially in the Umratul Qadha, they wanted to show the Mushrikeen that they were not weakened by the fever going around in Al-Madinah, and so they had to show them that they are strong, which is why they bore their right shoulders and ran or lightly jogged in the first 3 rounds. 1 or 2 rounds would not be sufficient enough to show strength. 3 is about right. 4, 5 or 6 or 7 would have been too much and unnecessary. Note that this is the halal type of showing off, because the Prophet ordered his companions to do this to show the mushrikeen. In other words, this is a type of showing off, is it not? But it is not the type of showing off in which you perform an act of ibadah to be praised by other people. Rather, this is performing this act of ibadah to enrage the mushrikeen. So notice the difference, that the riyah, which is to be blamed, is the riyah to impress others. This is a type of riyah, doing it to show others, but to enrage them. And that in itself is a praiseworthy action. Because if you perform your act of ibadah or implement any of the sunnah, and you thereby enrage the kuffar, then you are rewarded for this, on top of actually practicing the sunnah. Most scholars say that praying at the Maqam Ibrahim is a sunnah. Some have said it is wajib because of the ayah giving an order. وَاتَّخِذُوا مِن مَقَامِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ مُصَلَّى. Ibrahim alayhi salam stood on this stone to build the Kaaba. But if you cannot pray in that particular place, then pray anywhere in the masjid. And it is also sunnah to recite those 2 surahs, Al-Kafirun and Al-Ikhlas. They are both surahs of Tawheed. Al-Kafirun is Tawheed Amali, because it talks about worshipping, meaning doing some physical actions. And the Ikhlas is Tawheed Khabari. It is giving Tawheed in terms of information, not physical action. So it's talking about Allah Jalla wa Ala being one. So both of these surahs go hand in hand. One is Tawheed Amali and the other is Tawheed Khabari. Note also that the Istilam, which is when you wipe the black stone with your hand, is done at the beginning and at the end of the tawaf as well, when you go to perform the sa'i. And we also learn that you begin at the Mount Safa, because that's how Allah begins in the ayah. Now it is not wajib to ascend this mountain, rather just to be at the bottom of it is sufficient. Notice also it is sunnah that when you ascend the mountain you face the Kaaba and you make the takbir and the tahleel, and you make that dhikr which has been mentioned 3 times with the dua after it as well, 3 times each. You then walk to the Mount Al-Marwa. Now you don't find the bottom of a valley anymore, it's just a flat plain, but you do have those green lights which tell you when to make the Ramal. And this Ramal is in imitation of Ismail, the mother of Ismail, who also ran in those places. When the dates and the water which were with her, they ran out, so she went looking for food and drink for her child who was crying. So after she completed 7 rounds of running between the 2 mountains, Jibreel alayhi salam struck the earth with his wings and the Zamzam water sprouted out. Notice in this narration that Ali radiallahu anh did not know exactly which ihram he was entering. He just said, I'm entering the ihram, the Prophet is entering. And we find that this is permissible for anyone. You can make the intention that you're entering the ihram the same as whatever such and such a person is entering, and that will be absolutely fine. We also take that in Mina, the Prophet prayed 5 prayers of Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha and Fajr. Staying at Mina is not wajib because of the hadith of Urwa ibn al-Mudarris, where the Prophet mentioned what you have to do for your Hajj to be complete and your rituals to be finished, and Mina was not part of that. Some people take from this narration that you stop at Namira and it is part of Arafah, but what is correct is that Namira is before Arafah, and you're not allowed to stay there during the time of Arafah. Rather, you must be within the limits of Arafah, and these boundaries are delineated. Notice here the Prophet asked a tent to be erected for him. Now, you don't normally ask people to do things for you. However, with the Prophet, it would be a pleasure for people to work for the Prophet. So it's not like anyone can have a minna against the Prophet and remind the Prophet of the favors they did to him. Notice what we can pick up from the khutbah of the Prophet, where he gave that at the bottom of the valley on the day of Arafah, that he does not show any favoritism to his family members, be it in terms of riba or blood revenge. And we all know the hadith that the Prophet said, even if Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, was to steal, I would cut off her hand. Notice in the khutbah, the Prophet says that if they allow anyone to enter your house whom you do not like, then hit them, referring to your wives. Now, this is not beating them up, this is simply a disciplinary hitting to show that you are displeased and that they have transgressed against your rights. It is permissible to give the wife a disciplinary hit, just as it is permissible to give your children a disciplinary hit, and this is a right the husband has because he has authority in the house. But it needs to be noted that in so doing, meaning to say in so hitting either your children or the wife, you must have in mind that the aim is that they should fear Allah, not fear you. So if you give them a severe beating in which you bruise them or make them bleed, then they're going to start fearing you. But just a light disciplinary hitting would mean that they will start to fear Allah and give you their due rights, which Allah Jalla wa Ala has dictated. Even though it is permitted to hit the wife under these conditions, many ulama have said it is better that you don't, and that these conflicts can be resolved without the need to strike anyone. Notice the right the wife has that you must feed her and clothe her on reasonable basis. So if you're richer, you will spend more on her, and if you're poorer, you will spend less on her. It depends on the richness of the husband. لِيُنْفِقْ ذُو سَعَةٍ مِّن سَعَتِهِ. Let the rich one spend from his richness. Notice that if the wife is rich, she is not obliged to spend on the husband. Rather, the husband is obliged to work and earn his money. The husband has to spend on the wife, and this is as a payment for him enjoying her intimate company. Therefore, if she does not give him his due rights in terms of obedience and intimacy, then he does not have to spend on her. We can also take that there is no Salat al-Jum'ah at Yawm Arafah if it is on a Friday, because that Arafah happened on the Friday and the Prophet did not pray Salat al-Jum'ah. That khutbah was not the khutbah of Jum'ah, because we know the Prophet prayed Dhuhr and Asr combined. He did not pray Salat al-Jum'ah, and likewise that khutbah was before the adhan, whereas the khutbah of the Yawm al-Jum'ah is after the adhan. Notice how he points his finger upwards and he says, "Oh Allah, bear witness to this." It indicates to us that Allah is above us, He is high up, both in terms of His direction and in terms of His attributes. They are the highest and purest of attributes. We also learn that you pray the Maghrib and Isha at Muzdalifah. You will combine it. If the time of Isha is going to run out and you have not reached Al-Muzdalifah yet, then you would pray on the way, but you must not delay until after the time. It does not mention whether he prayed Salat al-Witr, but we know that the Prophet always prayed Salat al-Witr, whether resident or during a travel. And at Muzdalifah, the Prophet differed from the Quraysh. Firstly, at Arafah he differed from the Quraysh in that he actually went to Arafah. The Quraysh would not. And again at Muzdalifah he differed from the Quraysh. The Quraysh would leave Muzdalifah after the sunrise, when the sun would shine brightly on the mountain called Thabir. But the Prophet left Muzdalifah before sunrise, but it was still quite light. and after Fajr he spent time at the Al-Mash'ar al-Haram, which is a small hill or a small mountain, making dua. But you can make dua anywhere in Muzdalifah. You don't have to be at the Al-Mash'ar al-Haram, the small mountain. Notice how he turned Al-Fadl ibn Abbas's face away from the women. You do not look at the women who are not mahram to you. And so if somebody is doing that, you would advise him. Of course, the Prophet physically intervened. He could do that. You, O listener, akramakallah, may not be able to physically intervene. However, you always have your tongue with which to advise. Notice during his travel to Mina from Muzdalifah, he passed by the valley of Muhassir and he rode a bit more quickly there. Some say he rode quickly there because it was there that the people of the elephant stopped. But that's not correct. The people of the elephant stopped at a place called Mughammas and not at Muhassir. Others have said that the mushrikun would stop there at Muhassir and recall the feats of their forefathers. That's why the Prophet wanted to differ from them. But there does not seem to be particularly any evidence for this claim. It appears the most sensible explanation is that this is a place where there are many stones and rocks and it is more difficult to traverse. This is why the Prophet made the camel go faster so they could escape this place a little faster, because it is difficult to traverse and less comfortable. We learn that just as you have the Tahiyyatul Masjid, you also have the Tahiyyatul Mina, the greeting of the Mina, if you like, and that is stoning the Al-Jamratul Aqba. He picked up the stones on his way from Muzdalifah to Mina. The stones are about chickpeas in size. We learn the Prophet sacrificed these animals. Now the meat is not intended here. What is intended is that you offer this act of ibadah, which is to sacrifice the animal for the sake of Allah in order to gain a nearness to Him. And so when people start to pay money to have the animal sacrificed on their behalf, though it is permissible, but it is not the same thing as drawing closer to Allah with this sacrifice. It's the actual physical action of worship which matters here, not the meat of the animal. Also, we find a good trait and a fadila or a virtue of Ali radiallahu anhu in that the Prophet allowed him to share in sacrificing the 100 camels. This hadith does not mention the shaving the head, but we know from other narrations that you do it after the animal sacrifice and before the Tawaf al-Ifadah. The order is that you pelt the Jamrat al-Aqba when you reach Mina, then you make the animal sacrifice and then you shave your head, then you perform the Tawaf al-Ifadah and the Sa'i if it applies to you, meaning if you have not already done it in a state of Qiran. This narration tells us that he prayed the Salat al-Dhuhr in Mecca. Other narrations tell us that he prayed it in Mina. To combine these two, we can say he prayed it in Mina and he also prayed it in Mecca with those who did not pray it with him at Mina. Also, we take that the Prophet drank from the Zamzam water, and this is obviously something that should be done. He drank this standing up. There's no particular reason as to why he did that. It's not like it's an act of ibadah that you should drink it standing up. Maybe he stood up so that he could drink more of it, or perhaps he stood up because the place was tight. In any case, drinking standing up is permissible, but sitting down is better. Notice also in the hadith, during the last circuit of the Sa'i, he ordered some people to change their niyyah to an Umrah, whereas previously they had made the intention for the Hajj. So it shows us that this can be done before you have completed the Sa'i, to change your intention from a Hajj to a single Umrah. And then you're going to release yourself from the Ihram and then re-enter the Ihram for the Hajj on the 8th day. So even if you left it till the last circuit of the Sa'i, the intention can still be changed, because the normal rules of intention don't normally apply to the Hajj. It's not like the Salah. Halfway through your Dhuhr prayer, you cannot intend that you're going to finish off the first 2 rak'ah for the Fajr prayer and change it to a Fajr. That will not work. But it does work with the Hajj. Hadith number 18, that the whole of the Arafah is a place of standing. From Jabir, the Prophet said, نحرتها هنا ومنى كلها منحر فانحروا في رحالكم ووقفتها هنا وعرفة كلها موقف ووقفتها هنا وجمع كلها موقف. I sacrificed here, but the whole of Mina is a place of sacrifice, so sacrifice wherever you are stationary. And I stood here, but the whole of Arafah is a place of standing. And I stood here, but the whole of Muzdalifah is a place of standing or stopping at. So this hadith makes life easy. These are vast places. You can stand anywhere you want in Arafah and at Jam', which is Muzdalifah. And likewise in Mina, which is part of the Haram, you can sacrifice anywhere you want to. The sacrificial animal of the tamattu' must be done in the Haram. It is not allowed to be done in the Hill, because Allah says, حَتَّى يَبْلُغَ الْهَدْيُ مَحِلَّ, until the hadi reaches its place. And this place needs to be in the Haram. Likewise, when you leave off a wajib action of the Hajj, then this sacrificial animal to be given is to be done in the Haram. Likewise, for killing a game animal in the state of Ihram, the Bahimatul An'am must be sacrificed in the Haram and given to the poor of the Haram. Hadith number 19, about the statement of Allah, ثُمَّ أَفِيضُوا مِنْ حَيْثُ أَفَاضَ النَّاسِ, then depart from the place where all the people depart from. From Aisha, she says that the Quraysh would stop and stay at Muzdalifah and not at Arafah, and they would name it Al-Hums. But the rest of the Arab would stop at Arafah. So when Islam came, the Prophet ordered the people to go to Arafah and to stop there, and then to depart from there, meaning to make ifadah from there. And that refers to the statement of Allah, ثُمَّ أَفِيضُوا مِنْ حَيْثُ أَفَاضَ النَّاسِ, then depart from where the people depart, meaning depart from Arafah. So this is clear enough. The Prophet did this to oppose the Quraysh. The Quraysh would say, we are the people of Haram, so we will not leave Haram. And the rest of the Arab, they would leave the Haram and stay at Arafah. So Allah says that you must do like what the rest of the people are doing, not like what the Quraysh are doing. Hadith number 20, about the abrogation of just leaving the Ihram whenever you want to, and the order to complete the Hajj and the Umrah. From Abu Musa, he says, I came to the Prophet whilst the Prophet was encamping at Al-Batha. He asked me, did you intend to perform Hajj? I said yes. And he asked me, what Ihram did you enter? And I said, لبيك بإهلال كإهلال النبي. I'm responding to your call with the talbiyah of the Prophet. And then the Prophet said, فَقَدْ أَحْسَنْتَ طُفْ بِالْبَيْتِ وَبِالصَّفَا وَالْمَرْوَةِ وَأَحِلَّ. So he says that I made the tawaf and the sa'i between the Safa and Marwa. Then a woman from Banu Qais came and clipped my hair. And then again I made the ihlal or the talbiyah for the Hajj when the Hajj time came. Now Abu Musa says that he would give this fatwa to the people, that you perform the Umrah, release yourself from the Ihram, and then you perform the Hajj separately. Until when it was the Khilafah of Umar ibn al-Khattab, he says a man came to me and he said, do not give the fatwa you are giving of the tamattu', because you do not know what new ruling the Amirul Mu'mineen is giving about the Hajj. So Abu Musa says, O people, do not follow my fatwa because the Amirul Mu'mineen is going to address you, and you should follow him. He says that Umar radiallahu anh came, and I mentioned that to him, meaning this difference of opinion about the tamattu', should you perform it or not. And Umar said, if we take from the Book of Allah, then the Book of Allah orders us to complete the Hajj and the Umrah, so as not to leave the Ihram. And if we take from the Sunnah of the Prophet, then the Sunnah of the Prophet is that he did not leave the Ihram until he sacrificed the animal. So in other words, Umar is saying here that whether we look at the Quran or the Sunnah, you do not leave the state of Ihram by performing an Umrah separately, and then afterwards performing the Hajj separately. Rather, you go on and complete the Hajj or the Umrah. Now, Umar radiallahu anh, as knowledgeable as he may have been, got this one wrong. Because what Umar has just said, that you complete the Hajj and the Umrah, is in direct contradiction to what the Prophet ordered his companions to do. Therefore, we do not take from what Umar is telling us here, though he is rewarded for his ijtihad. But look at a vital point here. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari radiallahu anh said to the people, do not follow me, but rather follow the leader of the believers. So he would let go of his own opinion and give precedence to the leader. So you see, this is a man who is not just feeding his ego, rather he wants to give unity precedence over his own personal fiqh opinion. And this is the way the Muslim must do it. And in Abu Musa al-Ash'ari we have a fine example. The reason why Umar would not want people to perform the tamattu' is because if they perform the Umrah during the month of the Hajj, then the rest of the year no one is going to visit the house, and so it will become derelict. And so this could be a possible justification for why Umar said what he said.
Otherwise, the order of the Prophet is quite clear. If you have not brought along a sacrificial animal, then turn your Hajj into an Umrah, then release yourself from it, then re-enter the Umrah for a single Hajj. Let's just add in a few more points of benefit. With regards to the deceased Muhrim and being washed with Sidr, then it is permissible from that to cut down the tree of Sidr, or the lote tree. There is an authentic hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud, Man qata'a shajara sidrin, sawwab Allahu ra'sahu fin nar. Whoever cuts down the lote tree, then Allah will direct his head into the fire. The way to understand that hadith would be, whoever cuts it unnecessarily, because the lote tree is useful for animals to eat from and for the wayfarer to take shade in. So cutting it down would be a harm. Also, with regards to the hadith of Duba'ah bint al-Zubayr about making the condition, then this needs to be made verbally. A mere intention in the heart is not enough. And this is what is apparent from the narration. Also, with regards to Aisha radiallahu anha performing the Umrah after her Hajj, she in fact performed the Umrah twice, because the first one was the Umrah and the Hajj combined. But she insisted on doing two separate rituals, like many of the other people did. So based on that, one may argue that it is permissible to perform the Umrah after your Hajj, and that you may perform the Umrah multiple times in a year, even though the Prophet himself did not do this, and did not order it to be done. And definitely the Prophet is making life easier this way. However, when Aisha insisted, he allowed her. So we may say that it is not haram, but it is more emphasized for a person in the situation of Aisha. But if somebody other than in her situation does it, then it is difficult to object, due to the lack of evidence prohibiting such an action. Also, picking up some fawaid from the description of the Hajj from Jabir radiallahu anh, we find that you should enter Arafah after the Zawal, because the Prophet stayed at Namira before Zawal, and at least some part of the Masjid of Namira nowadays is outside of Arafah. So you enter Arafah after the Zawal, and this is the weightier opinion. And the combining of Dhuhr and Asr at Zawal is for everyone, even the non-traveler, because you should combine it so as to leave the rest of the day free to making dua and adhkar. Now, upon leaving Arafah, you do not pray the Maghrib. You pray it at Muzdalifah, combining it with Salat al-Isha during the time of Isha. Question is this because of the travel, or is it because of the nusuk, the rituals of the Hajj? And it appears the weightier opinion, as held by some scholars, is that this is not because of travel, but rather it is because of the actual ritual. So everyone, traveler and resident, will combine Maghrib and Isha together at Muzdalifah, at the time of Isha. In combining the salawat, you have one adhan and two iqamas for each salah. Now, according to the Hanbali madhab, staying the night at Muzdalifah, this is after Arafah, is wajib, and no doubt, whatever the ruling is, we ought not to miss this ritual off, because it is a major ritual, as you have to spend the whole night there. But strictly speaking, according to the hadith of Urwa ibn al-Mudarris, it appears that staying the night at Muzdalifah is sunnah and not wajib, and that what is more emphasized and wajib is to pray the Salat al-Subh at Muzdalifah, and then to stay there making dhikr until it becomes light, and leave before sunrise. Allah Jalla wa Ala teaches us, فَذْكُرُ اللَّهَ عِنْدَ الْمَشْعَرِ الْحَرَامِ. Make mention of Allah at the sacred place. And all of Muzdalifah is the sacred place. And this takes place after Salat al-Subh, not before, because before you are sleeping and resting. Also, in the narration about the ayah, ثُمَّ أَفِيضُ مِنْ حَيْثُ أَفَاضَ النَّاسِ, then pour out from where the people pour out from. And the narrator Aisha says that this ayah refers to Arafah. However, looking at the context of these ayat in Surah Al-Baqarah, this is ayah 199 and the one before it, it appears that Allah Jalla wa Ala is saying, pour out from Muzdalifah, because prior to this he was talking about remembering Allah at the Al-Mash'ar al-Haram, which is Muzdalifah. So the context of the ayat may give you the impression that he's talking about Muzdalifah, but this narration tells us no, it is actually talking about Arafah, And this is why the Asbabun Nuzul are so vital. It helps us to understand the Quran and its context and what the words refer to. So our advice is always be referring to tafasir of the Quran. We take from the narration of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari that you can enter into the ihram which is actually unknown to you, because Abu Musa entered into the nusuk saying it should be the same one as the Prophet. And of course the Prophet was making the qiran, but because Abu Musa did not have the sacrificial animal, the Prophet told him to release himself from the ihram after the tawaf and the sa'i, and then re-enter the ihram for the Yawm al-Tarwiyah, where the Hajj begins. And Abu Musa al-Ash'ari would give fatwa based on this knowledge, so you should spread the knowledge and disseminate it. Also notice the character and conduct of Abu Musa radiallahu anh, in that he told people, do not immediately implement his fatwa because Umar radiallahu anh is going to issue a command, and that would be more worthy to be followed. Even though what is funny here is that Abu Musa, his fatwa is correct, and Umar radiallahu anh is mistaken in his verdict. And also it's worth pointing out that even though your nusuk can be mubham, you ought to know what it is exactly you are doing before you make your tawaf. Meaning to say, is this the tawaf of Umrah, or is it the tawaf of the Hajj, which would be the qiran? This ought to be known before the tawaf because you should know what exactly it is that you are doing. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. If you cut some hair off for, let's say, hijama, do you have to give a fidya? Question number 2. What is to be done with a deceased muhrim? Question number 3. Why did the Prophet make a ramal and al-ittiba', which is to uncover the right shoulder, during the tawaf al-qudum?